I will lead the theme Men in Nature. By 1215, at bio-extinction current rate, between 25 and 50% of all species will have disappeared, or there will have been too few of them to survive. There will be a few over-visited parks, the coral reefs will be beaten up, grasslands overgrazed. These are the words of Stuart Leonard Pym, an American-British biologist and a theoretical ecologist and expert in biodiversity and conservation biology. As more than 10 years have passed since he presented his vision, we are asking, are we still facing this danger? The first lecturer will be Miss Joanna Bagniewska. Having finished her doctorate at Oxford University, Miss Bagniewska is currently a teaching fellow at University of Reading as an expert zoologist and a science communicator. In her lecture, How to Protect Endangered Species, our distinguished guest will try to answer our question and give us a brief outlook on the problem. Mrs. Joanna Bagniewska, we are honored to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for the kind introduction. First question for you, can everyone hear me all right? Can the people at the back wave their hands? Okay. Hey, you can hear me, good. Okay, so I'm a zoologist and I largely deal with conservation biology, which is a very depressing subject, as you might have figured out from the introduction that you were given. But today, I will talk a little bit about the importance of wildlife and what can we do to best protect it, and also what current threats it is facing. So let's make it a little bit more interactive. If you were to name an endangered species, what would it be? Just throw some names at me. Rhinos. Okay. Anything? Pandas? Tigers, rhinos, pandas, tigers, what else? Leopards. What is it? Killer whales. Okay, cool. Yep. What else? Pandas, yes. Yes. I always ask this question, and I wonder how many I would guess before you say the actual species names. So this is what I've prepared. Yeah, we've had, tigers, pandas, rhinos named in the audience. Killer whales are not on my slide today, but, you know, with a bit of luck I could have added them there. People also very often say great apes, like gorillas and orangutans. They also say elephants, quite a lot. So, why is that so? Well, normally, these are the animals that get all the publicity. They're big, they're charismatic, they're fluffy, they've got eyes, they look very cute, we can relate to them. So, because of that, they get all the media attention, and they are the ones that are highly publicized as endangered species. Somehow, not many of you named a blobfish. Aww, look at him. Isn't he great? So the blobfish actually is a critically endangered fish that swims off the coast of Australia, and he may not be the prettiest looking thing, but he deserves our attention. A friend of mine called Simon Watt established what is known as the Ugly Animal Preservation Society to give a little bit more attention and credit to those less fortunate species that don't quite match our own vision of what a pretty animal looks like. Now, he normally pays attention to amphibians because amphibians are amongst some of the most endangered taxonomic groups out there. Now, amphibians can be quite ugly on the whole. If you think of toads, they're not quite as cute as pandas or tigers, but some of them can be pretty interesting. If you've ever taken an interest in tropical rainforests, then probably you remember the tiny little poison dart frogs. They're very colorful little ones. They're quite pretty, actually. So these are highly toxic. They live in the Amazon rainforest. And people decided to name them after food. Clearly something you really, really don't want to lick will be called very much like a tasty food. So I've got another question for you, and that is, which is a real frog? Out of tomato frog, chocolate frog, strawberry frog, and banana frog, which is real? Okay. Let's have a show of hands. So, who says tomato frog? Who says banana frog? Who says strawberry frog? And who says chocolate frog? Okay, I'm not talking about the Harry Potter ones. Oh. But, okay, so that was actually a trick question because all of them are real. So, ta-da! This is a tomato frog. And this is a banana frog. Yeah. Oh, it's quite nice. This is a strawberry frog. And then we've got... Just kidding, there is a chocolate frog. Of course there's a chocolate frog. So when you see them, just because they're called chocolate frogs, don't eat these guys, please. They're endangered and not very tasty, and you might die. So don't do that, okay? So, when we talk about species that we normally pay attention to, I mentioned, and you mentioned, the pandas and the tigers. And these are what we in conservation biology call flagship species. So flagship species are the ones that are big, charismatic, very attractive in one way or another. And these are the ones when you print out a WWF poster with these cute eyes looking right at you, who wouldn't give money to conservation of tigers? Come on, this is like your typical funding grabbing species. So the pandas, the orangutans, the tigers, the elephants, or the big fluffy cute ones, they're the fundraisers. So they themselves are of course endangered, but also normally when people give money, even though they give money for pandas, they also, by doing so, protect the panda habitat. And so it's not just conserving one species, but it's conserving the whole area. And also, they raise awareness about habitat destruction and about other threats to particular species. So this is the one type of species that we deal with. We also have what is known as umbrella species. So these can be charismatic and pretty, like the jaguar and the orangutan that are featured behind me. But also, these are animals that span over very large territories. So by protecting these ones, you protect a whole host of other species that might be a little bit less glamorous. So by protecting the jaguar's habitat, for instance, because, a majestic large cat, again, everybody's throwing money at it. You're also protecting the habitat of the tapir, which, let's be honest, looks like a big pig. And so not many people want to donate for that. As well as all sorts of other species that people don't even care enough about to name. All sorts of rodents, invertebrates, and of course plant species. So these are second type, the umbrella species. And then the third type is the keystone species. So the keystone species are species that are fundamental to an ecosystem. And an example of that could be prairie dogs. And prairie dogs don't look like much. They're small rodents that live in North America, but they're very, very important for the prairie ecosystem. So they dig burrows through the prairies. They aerate the soil. They are the major food source for a lot of different other species, such as the black-footed ferret, which is critically endangered because at some point in history, prairie dog numbers were declining. And so when you remove this species, the entire ecosystem around it will collapse. Another species like that is the elephant. The African elephant is especially an ecosystem engineer, that's what we call it. So what they do is they love eating trees. I don't know how well you can see it here, but you have an elephant. So this picture I have taken in South Africa. You see an elephant that takes a tree, turns it upside down, eats the roots, and then chucks it out. And they do that a lot. So the entire ecosystem is changing because of that. And so it's really important that they do this. The population is managed appropriately, because you don't want too many elephants in a very confined space, because you will run out of trees very, very quickly. But they disperse seeds, they allow other species to function in this new habitat, new trees to grow, etc., etc. So these are what we call the keystone species. Okay. So that brings us to the question of why should we actually conserve wildlife? We've looked at what sort of species we have to deal with. Why would we do it? Okay. So, a lot of the time when conservationists are asked why do they do what they do, they say, well, because wildlife has what is called an intrinsic value. So it has a value in itself just by being wildlife. The fact that it's there, the fact that we have biodiversity, a number of different species, is a value in its own right. These animals, plants, fungi have a right to exist, and we have an obligation to protect them. Also, in the grand scheme of things, we are losing a lot of species every day. And the estimates would go into thousands. We are not quite sure, because we don't even study them. Now, some sort of an extinction rate is normal, because species have been going extinct all the time throughout history, but currently we're facing not what is called a background extinction rate, but an increased extinction rate, which is largely due to human activity, and which is why we're dealing with this. But we don't even know what we're losing, because we haven't had a chance to study it. And in fact, we know more about the surface of the moon than what is going on at the bottoms of our oceans, which to me is quite staggering, actually. So, intrinsic value. Nice, but again, it's not very practical. So we can also look at what is called an instrumental value, so the practicalities of keeping a species around. And these are the concrete measurable gains that we gain from our species. Something that we can put a price on, something which brings us money, or when removed would cost us a lot of money. One of these things would be ecosystem services. So this is all that the ecosystem is providing us with for free, that we might not quite appreciate until it's removed. So of course it's plants providing us with oxygen, but it's also pollinators, so they are largely responsible for most of our food. And in parts of the world where pollinators are declining, because right now, I don't know if you're aware of the honeybee being very much in trouble throughout, especially North America and Europe and parts of Asia. But in places where honeybees are missing, people have to hand pollinate some of the plants. And it's tedious and it's costly. And if our pollinators are gone, A, we wouldn't be able to eat a lot of the crops that we have right now, or the fruit will be gone, for instance. B, if we do want to keep it, we will need to pay money for somebody to actually deal with it. And the pollinators do it for free. And that's one thing. But you can also have things like water retention by wetlands. So if we have areas of wetland, they absorb water, and therefore areas around them are less likely to flood. I live in the UK, which is a very rainy country, and floods are quite a problem. So we like our wetlands. They are there to make sure that we don't have to pay a fortune in insurance on our houses. And then also you have ecotourism. So people would come to different parts of the world to view specific wildlife species, or to be in a particular habitat, and that of course generates revenue as well. Okay. What about other things? Well, there's also medicine. So right now, most of our medicines would come from plant sources, which is not a very big surprise, but a lot of these would be from tropical species. So For instance, the pink flower behind me, that's the Madagascar periwinkle, and that's the basis of an anti-malarial drug. Now, Madagascar is a very special place. Unfortunately, it's also a very poor country with not much money to conserve its biodiversity. So even though there are a lot of endemic species there, so species that only exist in Madagascar, the government can't afford to protect it. So it's a problem, not just because Madagascar's diversity is beautiful and unique, but also because with the Madagascar periwinkle, we need to cure malaria. This tree here, the Pacific yew, is used to produce Taxol, which is a drug that's used in the treatment of cancer. So again, that is quite important. But there's also a lot of scope for future research. Now, this here is a bear that's hibernating. And bears are very interesting because they go to sleep for several months. Now, imagine if you went to sleep for several months. On one hand, it sounds kind of good. On the other hand, it would be tricky from a physiological standpoint. Because how is it that these bears lie in one place and one position and they don't get any sores on their skin? When people lie in one place in one position, like people who end up in hospitals with prolonged injuries, they have horrific scars on their skin unless somebody turns them over. Our skin is not able to cope with just constant pressure, but bears are able to do it just fine. How is it that they don't move and they don't digest their own bones, that they don't get osteoporosis? How is it that they don't go to the bathroom for however many months and they don't poison their own body with their own urine? We would not be able to do that, but there must be some chemicals that are responsible for it. We are not able to tell how exactly this works at this point of time, but solving these problems would be absolutely fantastic for medicine. Another thing is, these bears, before they hibernate, go on a very, very sugary diet with a lot of berries and a lot of calorific food. How is it that they get properly obese, but they never have diabetes? If we could find out, how much better off would we be? Now, the problem is, we could say, okay, well, let's study bears. Why don't we just study bears and find out more? The problem with that statement is we need to study bears in the wild, because that's where they hibernate. Bears in zoos don't tend to hibernate because they're fed throughout the year, because they're supposed to be, on display for the people to look at throughout the year. Everything is going on. They don't have their natural foraging cycle and their natural life history in the zoos. And so we need to protect the habitat of the bears if we want to study the processes that govern their biology. So that's also something to consider. Another thing is architecture. What we can learn from wildlife. This is actually quite fascinating, so we'll go into a slightly smaller scale than bears. This is mold. So not very impressive, what you find on your cheese if you've left it standing for too long. Now, what we have here is an experiment conducted in Japan. What they have done is they've placed a number of little food sources for the mold on a petri dish, and mold was left to create networks between these food sources, and the food patches were of slightly different sizes. Now, the food patches were put in the exact same layout as the major stops on the Tokyo underground network, which is seen here. Now, the fungus that has no brain, that is barely, even alive, managed to create a very similar network just by picking the most optimal way of getting from one source to another with the resources that are provided, which is quite incredible because nature is able to find the simplest solutions in the most optimal way. And so we can learn things like urban planning from it. So that's quite staggering. That's Mark Fricker's work, a colleague of mine from Oxford. But also, we can look at fish. So these are fish schooling. When you have a lot of fish together, some fish species would do that. There's also locusts that would gather around in crowds, and they would have specific patterns within those crowds. Why would we care about locusts? Why would we care about fish? Why would we care about starlings that are doing their murmuring flights? Well, we can observe that similar patterns are being used by people when they're walking down the street. So when you have people walking one way and people walking the other way, they would show similar types of patterns as the locusts, as the fish, as the starlings. And that can help us with our urban planning again. So this is a fascinating area to go into. If any of you want to become systems biologists, I would recommend that. Okay. So, how do we then decide what to prioritize? So we've got a number of species that are endangered. What do we choose? Well, we're starting off with 3 questions. First of all, how endangered is the species? Secondly, how useful is it for us? So can we make drugs out of it? Does it have a cultural value? Does it have any sort of other practical value, etc.? How would you feel if all the tigers in the world were gone? I mean, did any of you see a tiger in the wild? You did. Okay, that's awesome. Whereabouts? Where did you see it? You couldn't have seen a wild tiger in Africa. Leopard? Lion? Leopard? Okay. No, that's okay. That's okay. If you said a lion in Asia, I would believe that, but not the other way around. But even though we're unlikely to see tigers in the wild in our lifetime, because there's only 3,500 of them left in the wild, we'd probably feel a bit bad if we found out that the last tiger out there in the wild died today. So they have quite a big traditional cultural impact on us. So this combines both the intrinsic and the instrumental values that we give to wildlife. And also, how unique is the species? So how many similar species are out there? So we have on one side the San Joaquin antelope ground squirrel, on the other hand a platypus. Now ground squirrels, even though both of these animals are endangered, there are a lot of ground squirrels out there of different species. And okay, we would be very sad if this particular ground squirrel went extinct, but it's not that super unique. On the other hand, the platypus is incredibly unique. It's one of the 2 types of monotremes that we have. So losing it would be taking away a whole taxon. So we would normally prioritize something that does not have that many evolutionary relatives in that perspective. Okay. So to assess how endangered something is, the International Union for Conservation of Nature decided to do an assessment of the status of as many species as they can get a hold of. So they have not assessed all the species. They have probably assessed maybe 10% of mammals, probably about 30% of birds. It depends on what people can get a hold of and what they can study. But these animals that have been assessed and these plants that have been assessed would fall into the following categories. These concern near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and extinct. And there's also the grand category of data deficient, so we didn't have the time or the money to study this. And so all the species would be assigned a category. and then this would be compiled in the IUCN Red List, of which hopefully you have heard of. Now, if we look at moving a species from, let's say, the endangered category to a vulnerable category, so looking after it so much that it would grow in population numbers and it would bounce back and it would not be so threatened anymore, how much would it cost? So a question, yes, so let's just look at birds. You know, let's not be too greedy. Let's not pick absolutely everything. Let's just look at birds. If we were to change the status of all the endangered birds to vulnerable, how much money would it be? Too much? Billions of pounds. Okay. How much? 3 million, trillions. Okay, that's a lot. Okay, it's not as much as you think. It's $1 billion US per year for 10 years. I mean, it is a lot of money, right? It does sound like a humongous amount of money, $1 billion US per year for 10 years. But we can put it in perspective. So, right now we have only 12% of that to spend each year on the conservation of birds. But if we have our $1 billion, that's about half an advertising budget of a cosmetics company for a year, because you're worth it, right? Now, that's also, this is going to be fun, it's 1/20th of what Americans spend on ice cream each year. Yeah. And this really upsets some people. This is 1/100th of what the bankers were paid in bonuses in 2011. So just for that 1 year, it's not their regular salary, it's all the bonuses that they get. So, well, probably if you think of a high-flying Hollywood movie, that number again is not that much. If you think of footballers' salaries, that money, again, not that much. So, of course, if you come from a zoology perspective, where struggling for funding is what you go through every single day, then, yeah, it's a sum that you can never cope with. But in other industries, it's kind of the norm. Okay. So, when we do finally get the money to conserve our species, we want to look at the threats that they face. And E.O. Wilson, who is one of the greatest ecologists, I think, of our time, and also a really lovely person. He's, I think, 88 years old, an American from Alabama. He coined the term biodiversity. If you have a chance, read his works, because he writes very well about ant societies. So he invented the acronym HIPPO, and that means the key threats are habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution. You see where he's going with that, right? And this one is not that great because the P is here. It's the human overpopulation and overharvesting of species. So these would be the main threats. Some people would differ in opinions of what might be the more key of the threats. Some people would add wildlife diseases, but I'll go with Wilson's definition because I like hippos. Okay, so if we look at habitat destruction, this is something that most animals have to deal with on a daily basis. Their habitat, their territories are shrinking, and also their migration paths are being shortened. So when you have species that are large, that take up huge territories, such as wolves or bears or wolverines, you have to have connectivity of habitats. So this is especially tricky in a place like Europe, where you have different countries that are quite small, relatively speaking, and each one of them has a different governance. And there are different national park rules, there are different national park sizes. Generally, each country should set aside 10% of its area to be a national park. About 57–58% of the world's countries do that at the moment. But it's not enough that there are different national parks in different countries. You have to have connectivity between them. Because if a large ranging animal like a wolf goes to a different site, they need to have enough food. They need to find places where to hunt for that food. And if there's a road and a city and a road and a few other cities and then another national park, then getting from A to B for that wolf is a little bit more difficult. And there are cars along the way. And that's not good. When it comes to nesting sites, there is one particularly sad example of the sea turtles. So the sea turtles lay their eggs on beaches. And the females would then go back to the sea. And after the eggs hatch, the little sea turtle babies would dig their way out of their nests in the beach and then run as fast as they can to the sea where they're safe. So from the nest to the beach, they normally have to run about 100 meters, or maybe a little bit more, depending on where the female has laid her eggs. And during that hatching period, every animal that likes little turtles for breakfast or dinner, because it's normally at night, would come and try and feast on them. So you have birds, you have foxes, you have all sorts of things trying to predate on these baby sea turtles. The question for you is, how do the sea turtle babies know which way to go? They've just hatched. Okay, you know, I'll just finish the... Okay. They follow the light, yes. So they follow the light because in a completely dark environment, when you have a beach and you have the sea would reflect the light of the stars and the light of the moon. So you go straight towards the light and you find the sea and you're safe. But these days, people like to have nightclubs next to the beach because they're fun. And they like to have bars and they like to have hotels. And these produce an awful lot of light. Yep. Yeah, sometimes people do that. They have little guided walks, and they also scare away the predators to make sure that the turtles reach the sea. But it depends on the site, really, because in some areas where there are more people who care about conservation, they would do that. Also, sites would start putting big trees or bushes between the bars and the nesting sites to make sure that they're darker. But imagine if the sea turtles are already struggling to survive by going to the sea and they're going the wrong way. It's like one of the saddest things ever. But no, people do try to look after these turtles, but this is something you always have to bear in mind. And then habitat fragmentation is also something that takes place because we need to have agricultural land, we need to have a lot of palm oil or soya, and obviously this is where a lot of habitat disappears towards. The other one, invasive species, that's an interesting one because it's interesting for me because this is my research area. Invasive species are species that have been brought from one site to another, either by deliberate human activity or by accident. So a lot of species, for instance, would be transported on ships as part of ballast water. So when a ship takes cargo, before it takes on cargo and it has to go from spot A to spot B, it needs to be well weighted. So to gain this weight, it would take up water in the port and carry it around the other side of the world and release it there and then get more water from there. And so a lot of marine species would get a free lift from one part of the world to another. And so this is how invasive species can spread. There are species like the American mink, which we have brought into Europe because we like their fur, and these then got released or escaped from the fur farms and became a pest on our continent. Of course, the story of Australia that brought all sorts of species one after another, hoping that they would all eat each other, but none of them did, with the cane toads and the rabbits and the foxes and all of that. Australia is one big disaster when it comes to wildlife and invasive species. So they can have an impact on biodiversity, especially predators. Predators seem to be more successful than other species, than other taxonomic groups at becoming invasives. There is also an impact on agriculture. So you have pests such as the Colorado potato beetle, which would eat a lot of the crops found on the site. And you have an impact on public health. So you could have species such as the Asian tiger mosquito, which you can see above me. It's an animal that carries dengue fever and yellow fever. And this was normally found in Asia, but with the transport of tires, it made its way both to the south of Europe and also to the southern states of the US. And the diseases are now spreading throughout the Balkans and throughout Texas, Louisiana, Florida, etc. We know that it has been carried with the transport of tires because tires are just the perfect habitat for these mosquitoes, because mosquitoes need standing water to breed. So if you have tires and there's rain that falls into those tires, nobody empties them out, because why would they? And this is where mosquitoes breed. And this is also the current problem with the Zika virus. A lot of standing water in different places. So in Brazil, people try to empty things like water barrels for the rain, etc. When it comes to things like ragwort, which is the yellow plant that causes a lot of allergies, it's a plant found in Europe that was brought in from America. So there is an impact on public health. Pollution, our first P. So pollution works on a whole range of species in different ways. First of all, there's the effect of biomagnification, where you start off with small numbers of pollutants that normally get into the water, and the first item of the food chain that eats them is not normally very affected. But as the pollutants find its way to a larger animal, so if you have krill that's eaten by fish, that's eaten by ospreys or fish eagles, the predatory birds would accumulate so much of that pollutant that it would actually kill them or have an adverse effect in another way. Currently we're facing a disaster when it comes to vultures, especially vultures in Asia. So a lot of cow farmers in Asia use diclofenac, which is a substance for protecting cows. It's a medicine for cows, to look after their livestock. But when a cow dies and this cow is not removed from the field, vultures would come and sit on it and just eat it, as you can see on the picture. The diclofenac, unfortunately, has a disastrous consequence for vultures. So vultures get killed immediately after they eat a bit of it. And right now the vulture population has literally been decimated because vultures are not quite as glamorous as pandas. Nobody cares. But right now it is a big problem. Also, it has further impacts because vultures would remove decaying carcasses from the environment. When they're not there, something has to do it, but there aren't enough other predators to do it. And then, of course, you have spread of diseases, weakening of the body conditions of all the animals. So here on the picture you have frogs that suffer from chytrid fungus. So when you have a frog with a worsened body condition due to pollutants, because frogs absorb their oxygen through their skin, first of all, in polluted water, they simply suffocate because they can't get enough oxygen. Secondly, this can lead to spread of fungal diseases for amphibians. This is particularly bad because there is no cure for this disease at this moment, and because of it, amphibians are one of the most endangered taxa out there. So this is the depressing part of the talk. I'm sorry. Then, of course, we have human overpopulation, which I think is the biggest factor out there. There's more and more of us, and there is fewer and fewer wildlife areas out there, and that creates more and more potential for human-wildlife conflict, such as this incident here when you have elephants getting into crops. Now, we might side with the elephants, but if you were to sit in your backyard and notice a large animal coming at you, you'd be much less sympathetic. And people who live in the areas very close to wildlife are normally quite poor, and so for them, risking their life and limb and health and livelihood to deal with elephants is not a pleasant thing. And then there's also the potential for spread of zoonotic diseases, so diseases which are spread between humans and animals. And then finally, over-harvesting. So here, under this comes bushmeat trade, so taking wild animals, normally illegally. This is something that happens especially in tropical regions of Western Africa, of South America, and of Southeast Asia. People who can't afford other food sources would just go and hunt. The problem with that is the species that they hunt are largely endangered. Traditional Chinese medicine would also involve a lot of species that are endangered, such as rhinos. This is the principal reason for decline of rhinos. The Chinese are using their horns for various medical purposes. They can cure anything from cancer to impotence, it seems. But because of that, in the Kruger National Park, there are 3 rhinos being killed on average every single day, which is quite staggering. And then the exotic pet trade, something we don't normally think about that much, but it is quite horrific. I don't know how many of you have seen the video of the slow loris being tickled. Some of you have, some of you are nodding. Slow lorises are critically endangered, and they're also a venomous species. So to get it to a state where you can cuddle it, you have to remove its teeth, without anesthetic most of the time. You have to take it out of the wild. Exotic pet trade is a horrific thing from both a conservation and an animal welfare point of view. And there's too much of it. So, finally, what can we do? On a larger scale, as conservationists, we always have to consider the human factor. Otherwise, if we don't consider the human factor, people's animosities towards wildlife will grow. So, it's easy for us living in a city to go and tell someone else to deal with the lion that's in their backyard or the elephant that is raiding their crops. But the moment we have a mouse in our house, we set a mouse trap. How is the conflict different? What right do we have to tell people to face danger every day? So we have to understand both sides, and we have to try and separate the people from the wildlife as much as possible. Secondly, we have to invest more into science when it comes to conservation. So right now there's a lot of conservationists without a scientific background. They don't have scientific training. They have a lot of naturalist knowledge on site, but you need to have a proper scientific assessment of the project. So if you have a project, has it worked? Has it worked enough? Do you get your value for money? Do you learn anything from it? How can you employ it in other places? All of these things need to have a scientific base. You have to look at the bigger picture. So most of the time these days we don't look at the species conservation, we look at ecosystem conservation. And then politics. That's a huge, huge factor. So above me is a picture of the Ethiopian wolf. And that is an animal, it's the world's rarest canid species. So rarest dog-like animal. It's only found in the Bali Mountains of Ethiopia, and it's right now critically endangered. There's about 500 individuals left, and that's it. Now, many countries have offered that they would run captive breeding programs for the Ethiopian wolf. However, the Ethiopian government says that all the Ethiopian wolves are a national treasure, and you can't take them out of the country. In Ethiopia, which is not a very rich country, there are no breeding facilities for these wolves. So we're kind of in a limbo here. So it's up to you to get involved in policy making. And Yes, when you have to be in a position of power, of some sort of lobbying activity to get what you need. Because no matter how good your science is, if it's not being implemented, you can throw it out the window, unfortunately. And in our own capacity, what can we do? Well, first of all, eat less meat, eat less fish, especially fish. So you can look up the Good Fish Guide and look up the species which are not endangered. There aren't that many, but hey-ho. I'm not telling you to completely stop eating meat, but just maybe reduce it a little bit. Buy fewer things. Just reduce your consumptionism. This is not rocket science, and you probably have thought about it a little bit, but just let me reiterate. If you have cats, don't let them out of the house, please. Cats are number 2 killers after humans when it comes to wildlife. They take a lot of birds, they take a lot of small mammals, they take a lot of amphibians, and if you let them out of the house, they will, because they're cats, take advantage of it, and they will go and hunt. So, keep your cats at home. Please, please, please. And then, if you have a garden, try and plant native plants in it to prevent invasive species spreading. This is a risk. A lot of people do bring invasive plants and then they go and spread. Don't keep exotic pets at home. If you really, really have to make sure that they come from a legitimate source, that they're captive bred, they're not taken from the wild. Make sure that it's all legal. If you go to faraway exotic places, don't go to wildlife tourist attractions. Most of them have nothing to do with conservation. Most of them are quite terrible for animal welfare. There has been a paper published recently on the top 10 worst wildlife tourist attractions. You can look it up. So things like elephant rides, things like patting tigers in temples in Thailand. For some reason, that is very popular. Things like snake charming, like dancing bears, all of that is horrific. Do not contribute to it. Okay, and then buy locally if you can, if there is an option. If you have a choice, go for local produce. And in the end, if you have any spare money, support women's charities. I'm not saying that because I hate men. I don't hate men. In fact, most of the men I know are really nice. But in third world countries especially, when it comes to the increased human population, the responsibilities of how households are run, this is down to women. And in a lot of countries, women don't have access to education. And they need education to get the resources to make this planet a little bit more sustainable. So when it comes to third world countries, you just need to equalize the chances a little bit. Okay, so that is it from me. If you have any questions, you can either say them now or wait for the next section of the panel after the next talk. But thank you.